It was a little after midnight when the diner went quiet. A big man in a worn leather jacket stood at the counter, patting down his pockets, his face reddening as he realized his wallet was gone. He checked his jacket twice, then his saddlebag, then his jacket again, the way people do when panic hasn't caught up with reality yet. The manager didn't wait to hear an explanation. He raised his voice, called him a thief in front of the few tired customers scattered across the booths, and threatened to call the police over a $9 plate of eggs. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of burnt coffee hung heavy in the air, the kind of smell that clings to a place at that hour of the night. The biker didn't argue. He just stood there, absorbing it, the way people do when they've been humiliated before and learned that fighting back never helps. His hands stayed flat on the counter, not clenched, not defensive, just still. A trucker in the corner booth lowered his newspaper to watch. A teenage waitress froze mid-step near the coffee pot, unsure whether to intervene. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke up. The manager kept jabbing his finger toward the biker's chest, his voice climbing louder with every word, enjoying the small authority of the moment a little too much. At the far end of the counter sat a woman in scrubs, alone, finishing a coffee before her drive home. She had exactly enough cash in her purse for groceries the next morning, nothing more, and she'd counted it twice on her way in just to be sure. She watched the manager's finger jab toward the biker's chest, watched the big man's shoulders drop in quiet defeat, and something in her simply couldn't let it stand. Maybe it was 9 years of watching people get talked down to in hospital hallways. Maybe it was just exhaustion wearing down her patience for cruelty. She stood up, walked to the register, and told the manager to put the meal on her tab. The room went still. The manager blinked, confused, his mouth still open from whatever sentence he'd been building. He looked at her like she'd interrupted something important, then shrugged and rang it up anyway, muttering under his breath about people minding their own business. Emily didn't respond to that. She just slid her card across the counter and waited, refusing to make eye contact with anyone who might try to talk her out of it. The biker turned to look at her for the first time. He didn't smile, didn't thank her the way most people would with a quick nod and an awkward laugh. He studied her for a long moment instead, like he was trying to understand what kind of person does this for a total stranger at midnight. He asked her name. She hesitated, unsure why it mattered, then told him. Emily Carter. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he was filing it away somewhere permanent, somewhere it wouldn't get lost. Then he thanked her quietly, turned, and walked out into the night without another word. Emily sat back down and finished the last of her cold coffee, watching through the window as his headlight disappeared down the empty highway. She drove home thinking nothing more of it than any small kindness deserves, the kind of thing you do and forget about by the time you're pulling into your driveway. She had no idea that by morning, the quiet debt she'd created would bring nearly 200 bikers to the front doors of the hospital where she worked. She had no idea a promise had just been made in that empty diner, one that would not be forgotten by a single person who heard about it in the hours that followed. Before we continue this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By sunrise, the parking lot outside St. Augustine Medical Center would look like nothing the city had ever seen. Rows of motorcycles, engines silent, riders standing shoulder to shoulder in perfect discipline. No shouting, no chaos, just presence, heavy and unmistakable, the kind that makes people stop mid-sentence and stare out the window. Hospital administrators would panic before their morning coffee finished brewing in the break room, unsure whether to call the police or simply watch from behind the glass. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, one question would hang over the entire city. Who was this biker? And why would 200 men and women drop everything to answer his call over a $9 breakfast? That breakfast, though, was never really the story. The real story was the promise made in the hour after Emily drove home, when the biker picked up his phone in a gas station parking lot and made one call that would ripple across 4 states by dawn. To understand why, you have to understand who Emily Carter really was and what she was quietly fighting inside those hospital walls long before any of this began. Emily worked the pediatric oncology floor, the hardest wing in the building, the one nobody wanted to work, but somebody had to. She'd been there 9 years, watching children fight battles no child should have to fight, holding the hands of parents who couldn't hold themselves together anymore. She knew the sound a hallway makes right after a family gets bad news, that particular kind of silence that presses against your ears. She skipped meals more often than she'd admit, gave her lunch breaks to comfort families instead of eating, and drove home most nights too exhausted to cry even when she wanted to. The kids on her floor loved her, drew her pictures, saved her seats at movie nights in the recreation room. The parents trusted her completely, sometimes more than they trusted the doctors, because she was the one who sat with them at 2 in the morning when the machines beeped too loud to sleep through. But the hospital she worked for had been quietly falling apart around her for over a year. Budget cuts had gutted the security staff first, quiet reductions buried in memos nobody read carefully enough. Then supply shortages started hitting the pharmacy, forcing nurses to ration bandages and medication in ways that made Emily's stomach turn. The parking garage, once well lit and monitored by cameras on every level, had gone dark in 3 sections after the hospital decided the maintenance cost wasn't worth the investment. Nurses had started walking each other to their cars at night, not because policy told them to, but because nobody else would, and because 3 separate incidents in 6 months had made it clear nobody was coming to help if something happened. At the center of these cuts sat a hospital executive named Harold Mercer, a man more interested in quarterly reports than the people bleeding out reality behind his glass office door. Mercer smiled for cameras during charity galas, shook hands with donors, posed for photos beside oversized checks, and ignored every memo about safety concerns that crossed his desk. He'd built a reputation as a numbers man, someone who could trim a budget without ever setting foot on the floors those numbers actually affected. To him, a nurse walking alone to her car at 11 at night was a liability line item, not a person he owed anything to. While the hospital weakened from the inside, something worse was closing in from the outside. A street gang calling themselves the Iron Street Kings had been expanding their territory for months, moving through the neighborhoods surrounding St. Augustine like water finding cracks in a foundation. Their leader, a man named Victor Kane, ran the operation with cold efficiency, using teenagers who needed money more than they needed warnings and intimidation to keep witnesses silent long after the police stopped asking questions. Kane had his eyes on hospital pharmacy access for months, testing weaknesses, watching which employees looked tired enough, scared enough, alone enough to pressure into looking the other way. Emily didn't know it yet, but she was about to become his target, simply because she refused to look away from anything. The biker who walked out of that diner was named Mason Briggs, though almost nobody outside his circle used his real name anymore. Mason had been riding for over 3 decades, and in that time he built one of the most respected motorcycle brotherhoods on the East Coast, a network of riders who didn't do it for image or intimidation, but for something older than either of those things: loyalty. Mason had grown up poor in a house where the lights got shut off more often than they stayed on, and he'd been shown kindness by strangers at moments when he had nothing to offer back. A mechanic who fixed his first bike for free. A waitress who slipped him extra food without ever mentioning it. He never forgot a single one of those debts, and he'd spent his whole adult life quietly repaying them through other people. When Emily paid for his meal without asking who he was or why he needed it, Mason recognized something in her he'd spent his whole life protecting. He memorized her name for exactly one reason. Brotherhoods like his didn't forget kindness, and they always found a way to repay it, even when the person who gave it never expected anything in return. 2 weeks after that night at the diner, the danger inside St. Augustine escalated fast. A patient's older brother, a 17-year-old named Tyler trying to protect his sick sibling, was cornered in the parking garage by two of Kane's men and threatened into silence over a debt he didn't fully understand himself. He came to the hospital the next day with his hands shaking so badly he could barely sign the visitor log, and it was Emily who noticed. Emily who sat him down in an empty exam room and got the story out of him slowly, piece by piece. The gang wanted a way into the hospital's medicine supply, and they were done being patient about finding one. When Emily reported the incident to Harold Mercer, expecting action, expecting at minimum a phone call to the police, he told her flatly that hospital liability didn't cover parking lot altercations and that she should let security handle it. Security, of course, barely existed anymore, down to 2 guards for a facility that used to employ 12. She told him children were being frightened inside a building meant to protect them. She told him a 17-year-old boy had been threatened over something he had no part in. He told her, without even looking up from his desk, that she was on her own. That phrase followed Emily home that night, echoing louder than anything else he'd said. On her own. She thought about the years she'd given this hospital, the kids she'd comforted, the family she'd held together with nothing but patience and exhaustion, and she wondered for the first time if it was worth continuing at all. Staff had started resigning quietly, one by one, unwilling to work somewhere that wouldn't protect them, leaving notice letters on desks instead of having conversations nobody wanted to have. The hallways that once felt like a second home to Emily now felt like a place she had to survive rather than serve. And that shift in feeling scared her more than anything Kane's men had done so far. People like Harold Mercer count on good people staying quiet and scared long enough that nobody ever holds them accountable. If you believe leaders who abandon the people counting on them deserve to be exposed, hit like on this video right now and stay with us, because what happens next is going to surprise you. The following week, Kane's men grew bolder, testing the hospital's defenses the way water tests a crack before it becomes a flood. They confronted Emily directly outside the children's ward one afternoon, 2 of them leaning against the wall near the vending machines like they belonged there, watching her reaction as she walked past. Security didn't respond when a co-worker called it in. Harold Mercer had already left for the day, as he often did when trouble started, always somewhere else the moment things got difficult. Police response, when finally called, took nearly 20 minutes to arrive in a neighborhood that desperately needed faster protection than that. For one long, cold moment, Emily stood between 2 armed strangers and a hallway full of frightened children with absolutely nobody backing her up. She remembers the sound of a child crying somewhere behind her, muffled through a door, and how it steadied her more than it scared her, because she knew exactly who she needed to protect and exactly why she couldn't step aside. Kane's men eventually left without incident that day, but the message had been delivered clearly. Nobody was coming to help her. If she wanted this hospital protected, she'd have to find protection somewhere nobody had thought to look. That same night, while Emily lay awake replaying the moment in her mind over and over, Mason Briggs was making call after call across 4 states from the kitchen table of his small house outside the city. He didn't explain the full story to every chapter he reached. He didn't need to. He simply told them a nurse had shown him kindness when she had nothing to spare, and that nurse now needed protecting from people who thought nobody would notice what they were doing. Every single call ended the same way. No questions asked, no hesitation, just 3 words. "We'll ride." By 2 in the morning, veterans who'd fought overseas, mechanics who worked double shifts at the garage, fathers who'd normally be home asleep, and grandfathers who hadn't ridden long distance in years were already fueling their bikes, checking their gear, and pointing their headlights towards St. Augustine. This wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't about intimidation for its own sake. For Mason's brotherhood, this was about honor, about the belief that when someone quietly does the right thing without expecting anything back, the debt has to be repaid, no matter the distance, no matter the hour, no matter how many highways stood between them and that hospital. That code had held this brotherhood together for decades, long before Emily Carter ever stepped behind that diner counter, and it would hold long after this story ended too. Do you think people like Victor Kane deserve a second chance to change? Or should communities stand firmly together against people who prey on the vulnerable? Tell us your honest thoughts in the comments below, because this story is about to take a turn nobody at that hospital saw coming. By 4 in the morning, the low rumble of engines had started rolling into the streets surrounding St. Augustine, distant at first, then closer, then impossible to ignore. By 5, the hospital's windows were quietly vibrating from the sound, though nobody inside understood why yet. Security guards glancing nervously at each other in the otherwise empty lobby. When the sun finally rose over the city, nearly 200 motorcycles sat parked in perfect formation across the hospital's front lot and surrounding streets. No shouting, no aggression, just discipline and presence. Row after row of riders standing calmly beside their bikes as the entire city began to notice. Phones raised, traffic slowing, a crowd gathering at a respectful distance. Police arrived within minutes, expecting a confrontation, radios already calling for backup from 3 neighboring precincts. Instead, Mason stepped forward alone and calmly presented a folder of documents he'd prepared through the night. Legal ride permits, filed properly weeks in advance for unrelated purposes, but still valid. Charity registration paperwork tying the Brotherhood to community outreach work they'd done for years. A formal community protection notice filed with the city days earlier, the kind most people never bother reading the fine print on. Every single thing about their presence was lawful, organized, and deliberate. The officers lowered their radios, stunned, exchanging glances that said none of them had trained for a morning like this one. Hospital administration, watching from the windows above, had no idea what to do with 200 disciplined riders who'd broken no laws and were simply standing their ground in total silence. Harold Mercer arrived late, as always, and had to park 3 blocks away because his usual spot was surrounded. He walked the rest of the way in his tailored suit, sweating through his shirt, trying to piece together what exactly was happening to the hospital he thought he controlled. Victor Kane showed up that morning exactly like he always did, expecting fear, expecting an easy target the way he'd found one every other time he'd tested this hospital's defenses. Instead, he found himself staring at a wall of riders that stretched farther than he could count from where he stood at the edge of the parking lot. No weapons were drawn. None were needed. Kane looked around at the sheer number of people standing calmly against him. Veterans and grandfathers and mechanics who weren't moving, weren't shouting, weren't giving him anything to push against. For the first time in longer than he could remember, his confidence collapsed completely, and it showed in the way his shoulders dropped and his footsteps slowed. Within days, his operation quietly pulled out of the neighborhood entirely, unwilling to test a brotherhood that outnumbered and outmatched him without ever throwing a single punch. Mason found Emily inside the hospital lobby that morning, still in her scrubs from the overnight shift, still unaware of exactly how large this had become until she stepped through the doors and saw the crowd outside. He handed her an envelope, thick with donations collected overnight from riders across 4 states. Thousands of dollars meant for children's cancer treatment, for new security, For medicine the hospital had quietly run short of for months. His hands were steady when he passed it to her, though his voice caught slightly when he spoke. He looked her in the eyes and told her simply that she'd bought breakfast for one stranger, and 200 brothers had come to repay that kindness. Nurses cried in the hallway behind them. Parents applauded from the waiting room, some of them not even sure yet what exactly they were applauding for, only that it felt important. Sick children pressed their faces against the windows, watching riders who'd come only to protect them, some of them waving small hands at strangers who waved right back. Months later, St. Augustine looked like an entirely different hospital than the one Emily had almost walked away from. Security had been fully restored, with 12 guards back on staff and cameras relit across every level of the parking garage. New equipment funded through donations that kept arriving long after that first morning. Additional nurses hired to ease the unbearable hours staff had carried alone for too long, some of them recruited by Emily herself, word having spread about what kind of place this had become. Harold Mercer was quietly removed from his position after the story drew citywide attention. He could no longer hide from behind press releases and photo ops. A new hospital administrator, someone who'd actually worked a hospital floor before climbing into management, took his place within 2 months. Children on Emily's floor received the care they'd always deserved, and the neighborhood around the hospital slowly became safe again. Families walking to appointments in daylight without glancing over their shoulders the way they used to. Emily herself became known across the city, not for seeking recognition, which she actively avoided, but for the quiet act of kindness that had somehow changed everything around her. She still worked the same floor, still skipped meals more often than she should, but she no longer walked to her car alone at night, and she no longer felt like she was fighting this battle by herself. Mason never asked for credit, never gave interviews, never wanted his name attached to headlines or news segments that tried to track him down for weeks afterward. But every single morning after that, one motorcycle would quietly park near the hospital entrance before the sun came up. A different rider each day, the same silent promise repeated without fail, rain or shine, winter or summer. St. Augustine would never stand alone again, and everyone who worked there eventually understood exactly why. What this story really proves is simple. Small acts of kindness can awaken loyalty stronger than most people ever believe still exists in a world that often feels too tired or too cynical for it. Real strength doesn't come from fear or force. It comes from people willing to sacrifice their time, their comfort, and sometimes their safety for someone who once did the same for a stranger without expecting anything in return. Would you have helped that biker the way Emily did, even knowing you couldn't afford to lose that grocery money? What would you have done if you were standing in her shoes, alone in that hallway with nobody backing you up and children crying behind you? Do you believe loyalty like this still exists in the world today, or has it become something we only find in stories like this one? What's your take on this? Comment below. I'm reading every single one. If this story resonated with you, hit like and send it to someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, check out the previous videos on the channel.